So we're in the middle of a revolution in private sector intelligence.
Private sector intelligence.
What you're doing, by its very nature, is counterintelligence.
And I spent about 4 months reading books, and I was looking at the different intelligence services that were in World War II, and I thought, what lessons can we learn from World War II, lining back to our old school kind of tradecraft theme of the summit.
When we think about cybersecurity, it's unlikely that many of us start by thinking about intelligence during the Second World War. But this is exactly what Rick Holland is doing at a SANS CTI summit, an event for industry professionals interested in learning more about cyber threat intelligence.
These are some of the intel agencies in the European theater: MI6, MI5. On the Russian side, you had the NKGB and the NKVD.
Holland is clearly drawing a connection between the modern practice of cybersecurity and the world of traditional state intelligence activity. On one level, this makes sense. He's talking about cyber threat intelligence, after all. But I wanted to dig deeper and understand how exactly these two worlds come together in the field of cybersecurity. My name is Neil Ashdown, and I'm a student at Royal Holloway in the Centre for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity for the Everyday. Before starting at Royal Holloway, I worked in the private sector as an analyst focused on traditional defence and security issues. This is a video of me talking about Russia's military modernisation, for example.
So, ranging from the deployment of new submarines in Murmansk in the north, down through to...
My role involved following the work of intelligence services, and over time, I noticed that more and more information was emerging in the form of reporting by cybersecurity companies. Reports like this. This is the APT-1 report, released by a US company called Mandiant in 2013. It describes the activities of a threat actor that the report identifies as a specific unit within the Chinese military. Now, many of us are now familiar with reports like this from cybersecurity companies, but it's hard to overemphasize how surprising it was in 2013 to see this kind of detailed reporting on the activities of intelligence agencies. As time went on, the activities of states and their proxies in the cyber domain began affecting my work in other ways as well.
Breaking news, the FBI says that the North Korean government is responsible for the Sony cyber attack. What is your response?
Events like the Sony hack increased my interest in cybersecurity, and in particular in the role played by cybersecurity companies in tracking the activities of state intelligence services. So, over the summer of 2020, during the lockdown, I conducted a research project looking at the ways in which cyber threat intelligence practitioners talked about their work and the ways it related to traditional intelligence and counterintelligence. To begin with, I wanted to understand what practitioners of both CTI and counterintelligence meant when they used those terms. In both cases, I found that the definitions varied depending on the practitioner. In the case of CTI, I found a gap between the way cyber threat intelligence is described and the way it works in practice in many organisations. This is the definition of CTI from a UK government publication. As you can see, it's heavily focused on the intelligence aspect. The emphasis is on tracking adversaries and understanding their motivations and capabilities. They argue that it's easier to retrain traditional intelligence analysts to do cyber than to train cybersecurity experts to do intelligence. However, in practice, it is almost entirely the other way around. Academic research has shown that commercial CTI organisations are predominantly focused on technical analysis. And rather than reskilling intelligence analysts, most companies hire people primarily for their technical skills. Now, there is a balance here. Some CTI analysts focus primarily on strategic geopolitical analysis, but in general, CTI as a practice is much more technically focused than definitions such as the UK government's would suggest. I found a similar dynamic as I examined different definitions of counterintelligence. But before we think about counterintelligence, it makes sense to be clear on what intelligence is. When we think of spy films or novels, we often think of spies chasing spies. But in practice, much intelligence activity won't be focused on other intelligence services, but rather targets such as governments and militaries, the financial sector, or issues such as nuclear proliferation. This is intelligence. Counterintelligence is when the target is another intelligence agency. You can see that focus in definitions such as this one by William Odom, a former director of the US National Security Agency, or this one by Robert Jervis, an academic who worked as a consultant for the CIA. Both definitions focus on counterintelligence as a subset of intelligence. However, in my research, I also found other definitions that focused on counterintelligence as an activity, or effectively equated it with security. As Paul Raymond, a former head of CIA counterintelligence, has argued, the term counterintelligence means different things to different people. To help me keep track of these different conceptions of counterintelligence, I drew up this graphic. At the top, you can see counterintelligence as intelligence. This is the rarefied view of people like Odom and Jervis, who worked in foreign intelligence agencies. Looking down, we can see counterintelligence as activity. This conception will probably be more familiar to someone who worked in the FBI, for example. Finally, at the bottom of the pyramid, is the view of counterintelligence as primarily concerned with information security. Now, it's worth noting that in practice, all three levels are interrelated. You can't do the top level without being sure of the security of your intelligence organization, for example. Conversely, you wouldn't know where to target your counterintelligence activity without the intelligence component in the first place. Now, this theory matters because it gets us away from following contingent institutional definitions. And if you regard counterintelligence at its heart as intelligence about other intelligence services, then this raises an interesting question. When cyber threat intelligence companies are producing intelligence on intelligence services, are they therefore, in some sense, doing counterintelligence? I wanted to understand how CTI practitioners talked about intelligence in their work. In particular, I wanted to know whether they described the same overlap with counterintelligence that I saw when considering their work as an outside observer. Well, this matters because if aspects of CTI are effectively counterintelligence, then that brings with it a host of implications. CTI analysts would need to think about the possibility of deception, for example. They would even need to consider the risks of reprisals from state actors. Moreover, if CTI analysts were effectively doing counterintelligence without realizing it, then the open source literature on state counterintelligence activity might be helpful for them in doing their work. But to answer these questions, I needed a way to hear from the CTI practitioners themselves. The SANS Institute is a US-based research and education organization. It runs training courses on CTI and since 2014 has held a yearly cyber threat intelligence summit. These summits are intended to build a sense of community. Indeed, presenters at SANS summits often make this point themselves.
We in this room are this community.
As such, these summits can fairly be said to represent a part of the CTI industry, effectively in conversation with itself, about its identity, its values and aspirations. I decided to examine how the presenters at these summits talked about CTI and counterintelligence. To do this, I watched a lot of videos of summit presentations, over 35 hours worth. I took extensive notes and coded these based on the different themes that emerged, particularly around the issues of intelligence and counterintelligence and related themes such as analytic tradecraft or deception. I also paid attention to what the presenters didn't say, and I'll come back to that later. One of the first things I found was that the presenters at these summits absolutely made the connection between CTI and traditional state intelligence. We've already seen Rick Holland talking about the work of intelligence agencies in the Second World War, but here's another presenter, Rob Dartnell, taking an even broader view of the history of intelligence for the CTI audience.
From Sun Tzu, of course, the Middle Ages, Queen Elizabeth and her emissaries, the Venetians and their embassies and sending out their spies, the First World War, the Great War, the Second World War, Cold War.
Dartnell's presentation also underlines another key finding about the relationship between CTI and state intelligence. Many of the speakers at the events emphasised that they had backgrounds in state or military intelligence agencies. Dartnell himself states that his military intelligence background is one of the reasons the audience should view him as credible.
As the lovely Rebecca did say, I am an ex-conventional military intelligence person.
And here's another very important figure at the SANS Summit, Robert M. Lee, talking about his background in the NSA.
First got started, even though I was an Air Force officer, I never really worked in the Air Force. I got shipped off to one of the intelligence agencies pretty much day one.
It's public now, went over to the National Security Agency and built...
This focus on the presenters' backgrounds in intelligence reminded me of the differing understandings of CTI I talked about earlier in this video. And indeed, presenters only mentioned having a background in state intelligence in 45% of the videos I watched. Other presenters emphasised their technical credentials and gave presentations more focused on the technical aspects of CTI. One person I spoke to while conducting this research described this as a collision of cultures between the people with intelligence backgrounds and those from the technical side. This collision was made explicit in one of the earlier summit videos available online.
Before we get started, I want to make sure that we understand a little bit of who we're talking to. So, for those of you who feel like you identify as coming from more of an intel type of background, raise your hand. Just whatever that means to you. All right. If you feel like you come from an InfoSec or incident response or a Unix neckbeard background, okay, so it's about evenly split, would you say?
Maxwell's co-presenter, Scott Roberts, was similarly open about the difference in backgrounds seen in the industry.
Hands that you come out of the intelligence community. I'm super jealous, by the way. I wanted to be a spy growing up. I watched way too much James Bond as a kid. And so when this whole threat intelligence thing became a big deal, I thought, oh good, it's my chance to be a computer nerd and a spy at the same time.
The more I watched, the more it became clear that the SANS summits were very much trying to inculcate the idea that CTI analysts should look to intelligence history and the work of intelligence agencies to guide them in the practice of their work. 30% of videos explicitly referenced events from the history of intelligence, or emphasised the military and government pedigree of intelligence methodologies as a reason for CTI analysts to use them. Effectively, as Roberts put it, the SANS summits are teaching people to think like a spy and a computer nerd at the same time. The presenters were clearly talking about CTI as an activity related to traditional state intelligence. But there was a strange absence in the videos. Almost none of the presenters used the term counterintelligence to describe CTI. In fact, the only direct reference that I could find across the 35 plus hours of video was this one by Robert M. Lee.
Is all incident response to some level, because what you're doing by its very nature is counterintelligence. Some foreign adversary is doing an intelligence action against you or military, you're identifying it, patterning it, and trying to stop it.
Lee is a central figure at the SANS summits. He's a SANS instructor, the lead author of the SANS course on CTI, and he's an influential personality in the industry. Moreover, he worked at the NSA in a variety of defensive and offensive cyber roles. His description of CTI as, by its very nature, counterintelligence, is therefore as significant as it is rare. The absence of the term counterintelligence is particularly notable when presenters are talking about producing intelligence on state intelligence activity. For example, here's Todd Messick talking at a 2019 SANS summit about a case where the intruder on the network turned out to be part of the Chinese Ministry of State Security.
What we found out was the attackers were from the MSS, which they found, good old spy techniques of insider threat and actually engaging people inside the company were still a very valuable asset.
Similarly, the presenters were clearly aware of concerns that would be associated with counterintelligence. For example, in an otherwise predominantly technical talk, one presenter discussed the possibility of adversary deception, as well as the risk that publishing information would lead adversaries to change their behavior.
The more we started looking at it, the more red herrings that were in the malware. And it's just, you had little things that didn't really make sense and that were in there, but completely tied back to something else. And then we posted a blog post about that. So the interesting thing was, once we mentioned the XOR of the 22 hex, the other malware authors went and changed the malware based off of that. So a lot of interesting stuff around the. So the cool thing with doing that is they would change their malware, we would post a blog post. They would change their malware, we'd post a blog post. So there were several times where we would want to, and we figured this out early on. So we would go ahead, and when they would go and post something, we would try and burn a certain aspect, but not another aspect of it. And the interesting piece with doing that is you're now starting to understand the psychology and how your attacker interacts with you as a person.
One presenter who very much engaged with the implications of cyber threat intelligence reporting was Richard Baitlick. Speaking in one of the earlier videos available online, Baitlick describes CTI as part of a wider phenomenon.
So I'm going to give you the bottom line up front, so that if you only want to remember one thing, here it is. So we're in the middle of a revolution in private sector intelligence.
As an interesting side note, just look at how the style of the SANS summits has changed over time. Baitlick is wearing a suit and tie, and his presenting style and subject matter are much more what we would expect for someone working in the US intelligence community, for example. Compare that to the later, slickly produced SANS summits featuring informally dressed presenters giving light-hearted, meme-heavy talks. Perhaps because of his more serious approach, Baitlick is open in highlighting the risk of reprisals by state intelligence services on cybersecurity researchers.
The final risk I'll leave you with is personal. One of the people, I think it was an ESET researcher, talks about when he was doing analysis of Stuxnet, finding out that his apartment had been broken into, and someone...
At the end of his presentation, Baitlick is asked whether adversaries, aware of this growing private sector intelligence capability, could take counterintelligence activity against it.
this crowdsourcing of open intelligence, but you can hack crowdsourcing. Do you think there's going to be a counterintelligence surge towards screwing with people doing open source intelligence in the near
So
future?
often in our field, we have a very static view. Like, you do cyber hygiene and you're okay. Well, no, that's not true, right? This is an iterative process between offense and defense. And it's the same thing here. So as you see people have success with this approach, determined adversaries are going to figure out counters.
To summarise, the presenters are talking about producing intelligence on state intelligence services. And they are also clearly thinking about this as a competition with an adversary whose activities they are both collecting intelligence on and at times attempting to disrupt. Why then is the term counterintelligence not being used? One possibility is that much cyber threat intelligence practice is predominantly focused on curating or using data feeds made up of indicators of compromise. For people working in this sort of role, it's unlikely that what they're doing really does correspond to counterintelligence. However, as Mizik's presentation made clear, some people in the field really are tracking the activities of foreign intelligence services. Is it perhaps that people are simply not familiar with the term counterintelligence? Odom, the former director of the NSA, described counterintelligence as arcane. It's certainly not a well-understood activity. Now, there are plenty of people in the industry with government or military backgrounds who might be expected to recognise the term. But I come back to the collision of cultures present within CTI, and the idea that perhaps the tech people like Maxwell and Roberts, who suddenly found themselves doing intel, may not have fully appreciated all of the implications that brings. Thinking further about this, I came back to Lee. As we've seen, Lee recognises a connection between CTI and counterintelligence. But after that first mention in an early presentation, he doesn't use the term again. And I think the change in language might have something to do with Lee's view of the purpose of cyber threat intelligence and the way it relates to the thorny issue of attribution.
I actually have a huge problem with attribution. Here's where I think attribution actually hurts your team. I would say that attribution is not only mostly useless for our community, it is almost always damaging to your tactical level defenders.
Lee's opposition to attribution hinges on its perceived lack of value for people charged with defending networks. For these network defenders, it doesn't matter who is attacking them or why. The goal is to identify the intrusion and stop it. Moreover, Lee argues that the private sector doesn't really have the capability to identify the physical actors behind an intrusion, or to assess their intent. Indeed, he argues that even powerful signals intelligence agencies, such as his former employer, might not be able to do this.
If you are the NSA and you are living off of signals intelligence networks and telephone calls and cyber things, you might not have what you need from collection to be able to make that type of assessment. If you're the CIA and potentially have someone in the room who heard it get authorized, you might have better collection to support that assessment.
So to put it simply, for Lee, the aspect of cyber threat intelligence that most resembles counterintelligence is the one that he thinks is least useful for network defenders.
Does it matter if they're North Korea or not? No. They could be Syrian. It has no impact on anything for me because I did defense correctly.
Lee does acknowledge that CTI has other purposes than network defense.
For the strategic folks that you are actually going to use that information, go for it.
However, he seems broadly dismissive about the wider public role of CTI reporting.
But it doesn't need to be in the New York Times because that's never helpful to anybody.
It's worth remembering in this context that the wider public and academic understanding of the practical nature of conflict and competition in the cyber domain is largely dependent on the reporting of these private companies. The APT-1 report, for example, was much more detailed than the US government indictment of individuals from that unit of the Chinese military that was subsequently released. Lee's proposed approach to attribution would effectively walk the industry back from this role in informing society, with obvious implications for our understanding of the cyber domain more broadly. I set out to better understand the relationship between cyber threat intelligence and counterintelligence. In particular, I questioned whether some CTI activity was in effect private sector counterintelligence. My research into the SANS Summit videos showed that the presenters emphasised the industry's relationship with traditional state intelligence activity. Given this, I questioned the absence of the term counterintelligence. I'd like to offer a few concluding thoughts in this video. First, I've been talking throughout as if there is a clear distinction between state intelligence agencies and private sector threat intelligence. In practice, the public-private distinction is blurry even within state intelligence. When you consider the personal connections between individuals in government and in CTI companies that were on display at the SANS summits, the picture becomes even more blurry. This blurriness is important because it will be even less clear for foreign adversaries, who who may not even recognise the distinction between a private sector company and the government. For these adversaries, everything these CTI companies do may be viewed as an extension of the home government's policies. Second, I began this research with the view that the state's capabilities in the field of cyber intelligence greatly exceeded those of private companies. This is the view that Lee puts forward in his approach to attribution, for example. Now, there are certainly things intelligence agencies do that private companies cannot replicate. But the private sector revolution in intelligence that Baitlik talked about has narrowed the gap. And in the cyber domain in particular, where technological advancement and agility is key, and where so much that happens takes place in the private sector, it is possible that the balance may even be tipping against governments. My third observation is about norms around competition and conflict in the cyber domain. There are well-established norms around the counterintelligence competition between state intelligence agencies, but it seems unlikely that these norms extend to the counterintelligence-like activities of private companies. This is a serious question, and one that the CTI industry has perhaps not fully grappled with. Because the bulk of commercial CTI activity is concentrated in the US and in its partners, this issue hasn't gained a huge amount of attention. But if and when private companies in other states start publishing detailed reports on the activities of US and allied intelligence services, it's likely that people will take notice. Indeed, there have already been some signs of this emerging, with reports by Chinese cybersecurity firms claiming to expose cyber activity by the CIA, for example. Similarly, there is the possibility of foreign intelligence services carrying out offensive counterintelligence activity to disrupt the operations of cyber threat intelligence companies. And bear in mind that state responses are not limited to cyber means. They could include human intelligence operations, even covert action. What all of this highlights is that the world has become more complicated. Far from the traditional idea of counterintelligence competition only playing out between state intelligence services, we now see a complex network of interactions between state and non-state actors with varying motivations and risk appetites. As a starting point for understanding this world, academic researchers need to engage more with the CTI industry to build a better picture of how it works and what it does. And conversely, the CTI industry could look to academic work on intelligence competition to help it more fully conceptualize its own activities, and potentially to articulate a distinctly private sector form of counterintelligence. This video is based on the report that I wrote over the summer, which expounds on all of the issues I've discussed, and which includes a full set of academic references. I've also written 2 articles, one on deception and one on cyber threat intelligence for the magazine Jane's Intelligence Review. If you have any comments or questions about the research I've outlined in this video, you can see my email and my Twitter handle on the screen. I'd be very interested in hearing from you, and I hope you have enjoyed watching this video presentation.